A police officer was on patrol one night. It was dark and cold, and he was very tired. He drove around a small New Mexico town in his patrol car for hours, like he did every night. It was usually uneventful, seeing as the population of the town was only 667 people. On this night, the officer took his break from a medium-sized, almost pitch-black parking lot of the town's only supermarket. He slipped on his coffee as he checked through the police computer to find anything worth looking at. Several minutes later, he was about to leave when suddenly a mutilated corpse of some animal flew out of the darkness and landed on the windshield of the car. The officer then jumped back to his seat, startled when the blood from the animal splashed all over his windshield like a giant paintball exploding on the glass. As he got out of his car to try to find whoever threw the bloody mess, he shined his flashlight into the darkness, but out of the beam of light, it seemed like he just couldn't penetrate the blackness. He found nobody. He clicked on his radio to report the incident to the station, but when he waited for a response, all he received was static. He got back in his car, feeling baffled by what had just happened. He just sat back in the seat in the car and rubbed his eyes. Dumb kids, he thought to himself. Yet as soon as he thought of that, he realized that it was ridiculous that the kids would toss a gory mess onto the windshield of a police car at 3 a.m. in the morning. He then sat back and rubbed his eyes again, just as a loud, frantic thumping sound suddenly came from the back of the car. It sounded like someone was standing at the back of the car and was slamming something as hard as they could get against the trunk hatch. The policeman then jumped in his seat, quickly hopped out of his car, snapping on the flashlight and shining it towards the back of the car. What he saw made no sense. A tiny toddler sat with their back facing him at the back of the car. It made no sound. It didn't move a millimeter. The officer just crept slowly to the tiny child. The beam of the flashlight took his hand. He kept moving slowly to the back of the car. Frightened despite the harmless young child sitting there, what could have happened? He finally made it to the toddler, and he wasn't sure how long it would take him to move then 10 feet and then there. He slowly reached down to the child, his hand shaking. He just barely touched the tiny child's shoulder. When its head turned around, with a lightning-fast jerk, the tiny toddler's head had just turned a full 180 degrees around. But the officer wasn't looking at that. He was looking at its face. It was pure darkness. Something unable for somebody to fully describe, let alone understand. Two red, shining lights where the toddler's eyes should be, but the rest of his face was completely black. The officer was trapped in complete utter terror. His gaze was fixated on a malmoved violent. Evil eyes, all he saw was the lights shining brighter, brighter, and brighter still, until he was completely blinded. In this moment, this radio let out a loud, sharp, high-pitched, ear-piercing sound. The officer fell to his knees, clutching his throbbing ears. All he could see was deep, dark red light. He fell to the ground, riffing the floor from the pain surging through his skull. When he heard, even though the radio on his shoulder, the terrifying sound of crazy laughter. The sound echoed through his head. The laughter beat at his heart. It penetrated every living cell of his body, and it would not stop. Finally gathering what little strength he had, the officer stood up and ripped the radio off of his shoulder. His sight began to return to him, but the laughter continued. He realized now he had heard the laughter of his own mind, and he couldn't stop it. He ran back to his car, threw himself inside and turned the key in the ignition, but the car would not start. The man panicked. He reached for his radio to call for help. When he remembered, he threw it away. He pounded on the car's horn as hard as he could, hoping that it could draw the attention of someone, anyone that could help. He pounded on the horn as loud as he could until suddenly the headlights of the car came on. He saw through a spot, not covered in dark blood red on the windshield, but something horrifying. A tall, thin, black humanoid figure stood in the lights. It had the same pitch black face as the toddler, and the same terrifying eyes. The being stared at the officer, paralyzed in fear by his car by those red eyes, and it laughed. The man heard laughter everywhere in the brain, and it was the most frightening, painful thing he'd ever experienced. The officer finally broke a gaze with his shaking hands and began making the last decision he would ever make, even though he wasn't looking at it. He could feel the presence of the creature getting closer to him. He felt the red eye, penetrating cautiousness, staring into his soul. He reached down his waist, pulled out his gun from his holster, put the barrel in his mouth, and pulled the trigger. Hours later that morning, another police cruiser found the car in the parking lot where the cop had been. The car was inspected, and inside there were no bloodstains or any trace of the policeman. A fully loaded police issue pistol was on the seat. The missing officer was never found. That day, the small New Mexico town's population went down to 666. Well, my pretties, that was The Laughing Stalkers, a creepypasta written by StairwayToHell11. My final thoughts on the story? I actually remember Silver Stories read this story. I believe I saw it last year, or maybe I did see the story this year. And I gotta say, this was honestly pretty good. You know, it starts off normally with the officer, doing his patrols when all of a sudden he hears something going on. And he ends up getting, a lot of crazy shit started happening. So it's honestly pretty surprising. So I definitely gotta say this one was actually a pretty good story, especially with the whole concept. I mean, the grammar was good for the most part. I did spot maybe a few grammatical errors. I believe there were a few punctuation errors in certain places of the story, but despite that, I actually really thought it was pretty good. So with the pasta itself, I can honestly see that it must be a haunted town, despite the fact that there was no trace of what happened to the officer after he took his own life. We don't really know, to be honest. It actually gets me, kind of wondering what it would happen to him or something. I mean, that's honestly been one of the questions I've been honestly really wanting to know. So, yeah, this is honestly a pretty interesting story. I still find it to be pretty cool, and I personally think it's pretty interesting. So, despite that, I honestly really like that story. So, yeah, it could use a little bit of improvement, but, not really too much improvement, but what I would say is maybe fix the grammatical errors and all that. But I can definitely say it's actually quite interesting. I still find this story to be, quite enjoyable in a sense. So I definitely would have to say pretty good story. I honestly give the author props for it. It's well-made story. So I could definitely say well done to the author. So, with that being said, I honestly do have to say this is on the regular Creepypasta Wiki. And if you want to go take a look at it, you are free to. You guys will pretty much enjoy this story. So, I guess with that being the case and with that being said, I'm going to sit here and say this is just simply my own personal opinion. And if you happen to disagree with me, that's perfectly okay too. We're all entitled to our own opinions regards to these creepypastas. This is just simply my own personal thoughts. My final rating is I'm going to give this one a 10 out of 10. It's a really well-made creepypasta. It's definitely a really good one. It's actually one of the, fewer good regular pastas that managed to do something good. And this one did a pretty good job. So, I guess that's all I really have to say. I don't really have much really to say about this story because it was still pretty amazing and well done. So, I could definitely say that's a pretty good one. But with that being said, what did you guys personally think of this creepypasta? Did you enjoy it? Did you not? Also, what we have done personally to help make this story a lot better. Feel free to leave me what your thoughts are down in the comments below. I'm the Queen of Lions. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you're new to this channel, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Ring the bell for notifications to when I upload. And as always, I'll see you all in the next video. And as always, please roll the outro because I'm out.